I kept my ledger open beside the stove, counting 14 days of roots like they were coins. When the creek skinned over and the bankman's clean boots showed up at my porch, I knew talk could turn into taking. So I notched a willow pole and sank our barrels into the spring-fed mud, because if the seal failed, Silas and I would go hungry by Christmas. The ice kept thickening, and all I could do was listen for the water moving underneath. October, 1874. Nebraska prairie, just outside a little settlement folks called Blackwood. The mornings had started to bite. Frost showed up on the creek grass before sunrise. Our cabin sat low near a spring-fed bend, roof patched with shakes and tarred cloth. I kept the north wall banked with earth where I could, and I slept light. My name is Martha. I was 62 that fall. Silas was 9, and small for his years, but steady when he tried. I had become his keeper, his builder, and his provider, whether I felt strong or not. We had 14 days of root food left if nothing spoiled, and only 32 split logs stacked under the lean-to. If our last roots froze or were stolen, Silas and I would be drinking thin corn water before Christmas. A sign of trouble showed itself early that week. The granary door hung crooked, hinge split clean through. When I pulled the latch, the whole plank face crumbled in my hands. Grasshopper dust puffed out like old flour. The bins inside were scraped bare, down to the nail heads. I stood there with that broken wood in my palms. Silas watched my face like it might teach him something. Behind him, our last flour sack leaned by the stove, tag still tied on with twine. Blackwood Milling Company. I was stamped across it, and someone had penciled 50 pounds long ago. The sack was light enough now to fold with one hand. His mother, my daughter, had left the year before. No grave, no letter that stayed. She went east with a man who promised work and a church pew. And then the prairie swallowed the promise. Silas's father had been gone longer. A fever came after a wagon spill on the Platte Road, and it took him in 3 days. So the boy stayed with me, and I stayed with the land, because leaving costs money first. By first light, I set my ledger on the table. It was a cheap book, cover warped from steam and winters. I wrote with a stub of pencil that made my fingers black. October 6th, beans, 1 cup, cornmeal, 2 cups, carrots, 4. A plain line of numbers, because numbers do not pity you. Silas put his hands on the table edge. You're counting again. I'm listening, I told him. He frowned. Listening to what? To the days, I said, and closed the ledger. Wind came out of the northwest after midday. It pressed through every seam in the cabin like it was looking for a way in. I found it at the window frame first, where the putty had cracked. Then I found it at the stovepipe joint, where soot had softened the old mud seal. At 10:15 p.m., by the dim oil lamp, I scraped that seam clean. I mixed clay, ash, and a pinch of salt in a tin lid. Silas held the lamp steady, eyes wide at the dark circle of pipe. When the draft finally steadied, I wrote a note and pinned it behind the kettle. 10:15 p.m., flue seam remudded, damper wire set true. Proof for myself that I had done what I could. The next morning, before dawn, I took Silas down to the creek. A mist hung over the water. The spring kept it running even when the air turned sharp. It wasn't warm. Nothing out there was warm, but it did not freeze fast, and that mattered. He looked at the mud bank and then at me. "What are we doing?" "Burying our winter," I said. "In water?" "In the ground, underwater," I corrected, because words matter when fear is listening. We had 3 barrels left from last year. One had held salt pork. One had held apple vinegar. One had been traded for from a man passing through, staves still tight, hoop iron rusted but sound. If a barrel holds brine, it can hold roots if you do not let it breathe. If it breathes, it spoils you. I had saved pine pitch in a tin, scraped from old stumps in summer. I warmed it in a pot until it ran thick. Silas cut strips of cloth from a worn sheet, the kind you do not miss when the cold comes. We laid the cloth around each lid groove. Pitch went over it. Then a ring of clay, pressed hard with thumb and knife handle. By 3:40, our hands were already stiff. Silas kept blowing into his fingers. I told him to do it with his palms cupped to keep the heat. He nodded like a man taking a lesson, though he was still a child. The creek bed was a trap if you stepped careless. Silt that looks firm can swallow you. I made him watch my boots. I showed him how to test with the shovel handle before shifting weight. He learned fast when the price of learning was cold water. Midday brought a thin sun and no comfort. We rolled the first barrel down on a sled made of 2 split rails and a rope. It thumped over stones. It scratched my palms. Silas leaned his shoulder into it and grunted. I face set with the kind of effort boys want, noticed. A neighbor, old Mr. Dern, saw us from the rise. He stood with his hands hooked in his suspenders. The man had a way of looking at you like you were already behind on something. "Carrying your supper to the fish," he called out. Silas's cheeks flushed. I kept my eyes on the rope. "Carrying it away from hands that don't earn it," I said. Mr. Dern snorted. "Water takes what it wants." "So do men," I answered, and the rope burned my skin as we pulled. We dug where the spring bubbled strongest. Not in the middle, where the current could undercut. Not too close to the bank, where ice would grip first. I chose a spot with willow roots knotted like fingers. That root held the bank. That root would also hold a marker. Silas wanted to ask about thieves. He did not say the word at first. He watched the trail behind us instead. Finally, he whispered, "Will they find it?" "Only if we teach them," I told him, "and we won't." The first hole filled with brown water the moment I lifted the shovel. Mud slumped back in. I worked the blade like I was cutting bread. Slow, firm, not wasting motion. 6 short scoops, then a pause to breathe and feel my back. One longer pull to clear the bottom, and the hole opened. When the barrel slid in, it did not want to go straight. The creek bed pushed at it like a stubborn hand. Silas braced it with a pole. I forced it down with the shovel edge and a stone weight. Water burped up around the staves. My heart thudded like a hammer. If it leaked, we would not know until we paid for it. I did not let Silas see the worry on my face. Instead, I spoke in steps. "Hold. Now press. Now don't let go." He followed, and the barrel settled. We packed mud over the lid until the lid vanished. Then we rolled stones over that, just enough to keep the current honest. Back at the cabin, I opened the root sack. Potatoes with eyes like small bruises. Turnips cut at the tops, still smelling of soil. Carrots with the thin ends broken from pulling. Silas counted them as I set them out. I let him count because counting makes you feel less helpless. That night, I wrote again. October 7th, barrel 1 filled, potatoes 41, turnips 18, carrots 26. The pencil squeaked. Silas watched the numbers like they were a spell. On the third day, a cold rain came. It turned to sleet before evening. Our yard became a field of glass. Silas slipped near the woodpile and went down hard. He did not cry, but his breath hitched. Then I checked his wrist and felt the bones. No bend, no swelling. Still, I sat him by the stove and made him drink warm water with a spoon of molasses. His boot heel had split open from the fall. The leather was thin where his toes bent. I set it on my knee and threaded a needle. 16 stitches across the welt, tight as I could pull them, then 3 more down the side seam. I counted out loud, not for pride, but for proof. 16, 17, 18. When I tied the knot, I wrote it in the ledger margin. Boot patch, 19 stitches, October 9th. A small record of a small repair that meant the world. By the time we sank the second barrel, the creek edges had begun to skin with ice at night. You could hear it in the morning, a faint crackle like paper. Silas broke a thin sheet with a stick and looked back at me. His eyes asked a question he was afraid to speak. I answered without waiting. Running water stays longer. Spring water stays longer. And if it stops, then we move faster, I said. We worked at first light again. My breath came out white. The shovel rang when it hit a buried stone. Silas carried rocks in his shirt hem, careful not to spill. When his hands shook, I made him stop and tuck them under his armpits. Cold does not respect courage. At midday, a wagon creaked past on the distant track. 2 men. A dog. They did not turn toward us, but I kept my body between Silas and the trail. After they were gone, I cut a straight willow pole and carried it home. That evening, with the lamp turned low, I sat at the table and notched the willow. 1 notch for each barrel. 2 notches close together for the first, because it held more. 3 notches spaced apart for the second, because it sat farther downstream. I made each cut with my knife, clean and shallow, the way you mark a board for later. Silas leaned in. What's that for? So we can find what we hide when everything looks the same, I said. He ran a finger over the notches. Like reading. Exactly like reading, I told him. The week after, I went to town once. It was 16 miles on foot if the ground held, and longer if it didn't. Silas stayed at the cabin with the door barred, and the dog tethered inside. I left him the ledger open on the table so he could see the plan. I also left the flour sack tag on the nail above the shelf, like a reminder not to waste. Blackwood was not much. A few buildings, a store with a porch, a stable that smelled of old hay, a church that looked tired. Men stood in the lee of the store and watched me like I had brought trouble. Mr. Halley, the storekeeper, had a pencil behind his ear. He was kind when it suited him. He was sharp when you owed. I laid my eggs on the counter, 2 dozen, wrapped in straw. He checked them with quick fingers. Grasshoppers got you too, he said, not asking. They got everybody, I answered. He offered a small sack of salt and a coil of lamp wick. I asked for beans. He shook his head at the price. I set my jaw and slid the eggs closer. He sighed and wrote out a trade chit, a small rectangle of paper smudged with his thumb. Credit, 35 cents, Martha H. He signed it and tore it clean. I folded it and put it in my pocket like it was money, because for us, it was. On the way back, clouds came low. Wind turned mean. I reached home after dark, feet numb, on shoulders aching, and found Silas sitting straight at the table. He had the ledger open. A line was added in his careful hand, letters crooked. Dog barked at 4. Sundown. No one came. I stared at that line for a long moment. My throat tightened, then I cleared it like it was nothing. "That's good," I told him. "That's proof," he said, proud and quiet. By mid-October, the first deep freeze rolled in like a wagon with no brake. It came after midnight. The cabin board snapped with the change. At 1:20, I woke to a hard silence outside, as if the whole world was holding its breath. I fed the stove 2 sticks, then 2 more. The draft pulled steady, and the flue note behind the kettle stayed pinned. In the morning, ice held the creek edges thick enough to walk on if you were foolish. We were not foolish as we stayed on the bank and listened. The spring still whispered under the ice. That whisper was hope you could not eat yet. Mr. Dern came again. This time he brought his son, a grown man with a sour face. They stood near the fence line, not crossing it, but close enough to make a point. "Word is, you're hiding food," Dern's son said. His tone carried the kind of hunger that isn't about food. Silas stepped behind me without thinking. I kept my voice calm. "Word travels faster than work," I told him. He laughed once. "Bank travels too." That hit where it was meant to. I had a note, and the note had dates. After they left, Silas asked, "Will they take the house?" I looked at the stove, at the seam I had sealed, at the ledger on the table. "Not today," I said. "Not if we keep living in it." The next visible sign came from the roof. A corner shake had lifted in the wind. Snow could get under it and melt, then freeze. That kind of small leak makes a ceiling fall when you least need it to. By midday, I had Silas hold the ladder steady while I climbed with a hammer and nails. My knees complained. My hands shook in the cold. Still, the nail heads bit into wood, and the shake sat flat again. That night, I marked the doorframe, not for height, for snow, a shallow cut at 8 inches, because that was what had drifted against the sill. I wrote beneath it, with charcoal, October 20th, 8 inches. When winter is long, you forget where it began. I did not want to forget. Late October brought a hard choice. Our wood stack was dropping fast. 32 logs became 24. 24 became 17. Some nights, I let the stove go down to coals just to save fuel, and we slept under quilts with our breath making clouds. At 5:15 one morning, Silas coughed. Not a small cough, a chest cough that stayed. I sat up and put my hand on his back. It felt too warm. Pneumonia does not announce itself politely. It arrives and asks, "If you are ready." Most folks are not. I warmed water. I made him sip. I rubbed his feet until the skin pinked. Then I did the thing I hated most. I took a shovel and started banking the north wall deeper. Earthburn work is slow when the ground is hard. You chip, you pry, you haul. You lay the sod like bricks. Silas tried to help, but I made him sit with a blanket around his shoulders and pass me the smaller pieces. Every 10 minutes, I checked his face. Every hour, I checked his breathing. By midday, the cabin looked like it had grown into the ground. The berm rose up to the window base on the cold side. Wind would still find seams, but it would lose some of its teeth. I stood back and watched Silas blink at it. "Are we burying the house too?" he asked. "Just the side the winter hates," I told him. "On Halloween, a man came from town. He wore a coat too fine for work. His boots were clean. That is how you spot danger in a hard season. He held papers in his hand, folded and refolded, like he wanted them to feel heavier. "Mrs. Harlan," he said, using the old name I barely kept. "Payment is late." I did not invite him in. I stood in the doorway with the dog pressed against my leg. Silas stayed behind me, silent, eyes fixed on the man's clean boots. "I have a trade chit," I said. "A chit is not a payment," he answered. I reached into my pocket and showed him Hallie's paper anyway. "Credit, 35 cents, Martha H." It was small. It was not enough. Still, I watched the man's eyes shift as he read it, like he disliked seeing me as a person. He glanced at the yard, at the berm, at the creek beyond. "You've been busy. Winter doesn't wait for a note," I said. He smiled thin. "I'll be back after the 1st of November." Then he stepped off the porch and left tracks that looked too sure. When he was gone, Silas let out the breath he had been holding. "Are we in trouble?" "We're in weather," I said. "Trouble is just weather with a face." November arrived with a sky that stayed gray for days. Snow started fine, then thickened. By midday on the 3rd, the drift at our door reached the first mark I had cut. 8 inches, then 12, then more. I cut a new notch at 14 and wrote beside it, November 3rd to 14th inches. Silas watched me do it like it mattered. It did. A visible consequence came from the creek. The surface began to harden across the middle, not just the edges, a lid of ice, milky and thick. The spring still moved under it, but slower. I could hear it if I knelt and put my ear close. That sound made my stomach knot. By first light on November 6th, I made the decision. We would check the barrels, not open them. Just check that the marker could still be found. Because if we lost the place, we lost the food, and losing the food was losing Silas. We walked down with an axe, an auger, and the notched willow pole. Silas carried the willow like a flag, careful not to drag it. Our breath fell onto our scarves and froze there. The ice cracked under my boot where it met the bank. I stepped back at once. No hero steps. Just careful steps. I set the auger on the ice and turned. The bit squealed. Shavings curled up white and wet. Silas leaned in, eyes following the spiral. When the bit broke through, dark water rose, then stilled. A spring breath. I listened, still moving, still alive. "Now, the pole," I said. He held it out. I lined up the notches with the willow roots on the bank, just like I had planned. 1 close pair, 3 spaced. I lowered the pole through the hole until it touched mud. Then I angled it. The tip bumped something solid. Wood. Barrel. Relief ran through me so fast my hands shook. Silas smiled without showing teeth. "It's there," he whispered. "Yes," I told him, "and it stays there until we need it." We covered the hole with ice blocks and packed snow over it. Not perfect. Nothing is perfect, but hidden enough that a wandering eye would see only winter. The next pressure came from people, not cold. Dern's son showed up again 2 days later, this time with another man. They carried a sack and a shovel. That told me what they thought they were entitled to. They did not come to talk. They came to take. I met them at the fence line. The dog growled low. Silas stood behind the door, ready to bar it. "Looking for something?" I asked. Dern's son glanced toward the creek. "Folks say you're sitting on food." "Folks say many things," I replied. The other man lifted his shovel. "Winter's hard for everybody." "It's hardest on those who waste summer," I said, calm and even, and that made them angry. Anger is easier than shame. They did not cross the fence, not with the dog and my axe leaning by the step. Still, they lingered long enough to make the air feel smaller. When they finally left, Silas came out and swallowed hard. "Will they come back at night?" "Maybe," I said. "Then we'll be awake." That night, after midnight, the dog barked once, then twice. A soft scrape came at the porch step. I did not light the lamp. I sat in the dark with the rifle across my knees, not to be dramatic, just to be alive. A shadow moved near the window, then another. Someone tested the latch. The bar held. A minute passed. 2. The wind pushed snow against the wall like it was trying to join them. Finally, footsteps crunched away. The dog stopped barking and returned to his corner, satisfied with his work. At dawn, I wrote it down. November 9th. After midnight. Latch tested. No entry. Silas watched me write. He nodded, like we had just put a stone on a grave. By mid-November, the temperature dropped hard. Night air burned your nostrils. At 3:10 one morning, the stove went dead. The coal bed had fallen through. I heard it, even half asleep, because the silence of a dead stove is loud. I got up without speaking. Hands moved from habit. Ash pan out. Coal stirred. Kindling placed. 2 sticks. 3. A flame caught, small and stubborn. When the heat returned, I felt it in my bones like a blessing. Silas coughed again that week. It stayed mild, but I did not trust mild in winter. I boiled spruce tips and made a bitter tea. He made a face. I did not soften it with extra molasses because molasses was measured. In the ledger, I wrote, November 14th, molasses, 1 spoon, tea, spruce. Then I added another line beneath it. Wood, 12 logs left. Numbers. Always numbers. A visible consequence beat came when the creek finally sealed. Not just a skin. A body of ice that held steady from bank to bank, 2 feet thick in places. You could hear it groan at night, a deep sound like the earth shifting in sleep. When it made that sound, Silas would look up from his bowl. I would keep my eyes on the spoon and my voice low. It's just settling, I'd tell him. Everything settles under pressure. In late November, the man with the clean boots returned. He brought someone else this time, a deputy from the county seat. The deputy had a long coat and a cold face. They stood on my porch like winter had hired them. Mrs. Harlan, the clean boot man said, you need to make a payment. I can pay in labor, come spring, I answered. He shook his head as if spring was a story for children. The deputy looked past me into the cabin. His eyes caught the flour sack tag on the nail. They caught the ledger on the table. They caught Silas, quiet and thin behind my skirt. Something in his face softened, just for a moment. Then it hardened again, because hard men need their hardness. Any assets? The deputy asked. I did not look toward the creek. I did not look toward the berm. I looked at the stove. A pot, a table, a roof that leaks, I said. The clean boot man sniffed. Folks say you're keeping food. I held his gaze. Folks talk because their mouths are warm, I replied. They left without stepping inside. Not mercy, calculation. A cabin in winter is a problem even the bank does not want to own. After they were gone, I sat down and let my hands rest. Silas brought me the willow pole. He held it like it was fragile. They didn't find it, he said. No, I told him, because we did not show it. December began with a hunger week, not the kind where you are completely without, the kind where every bite feels like a choice with a consequence. Beans ran low, cornmeal went thin. The last of the flour turned to paste if you tried to stretch it. Even the dog watched our bowls. On December 4th, at first light, I decided we would open one barrel, not because I wanted to, because the ledger said we had to. Food days, left. 6. I wrote the night before, and the pencil pressed through the paper. We went to the creek with the axe, the auger, and the willow pole. The wind was sharp enough to make tears freeze at the corner of your eye. Silas kept his scarf up. I kept my face bare, because a bare face tells you more. By 6:20, the auger had cut through. The hole was dark and round, like an eye. I lowered the willow pole, lining the notches with the root and the bend in the bank. The tip found the barrel with a dull knock. There it was, our buried winter. Breaking the ice wide enough took time. The axe head rang. The sound carried across the frozen bend. I paused between swings, not for drama, but because my shoulders needed it. 6 short chops, 1 longer pry. Ice cracked, a slab lifted. Cold water rose, then steadied. Silas held his breath. I reached down with the hook I had made from bent iron. Fingers burned the moment they touched water. I bit the inside of my cheek and did not curse. Then the hook caught the barrel hoop. I pulled. The barrel resisted like it was part of the creek now. Silas leaned back with me, both of us pulling together. Mud released in a slow, sucking sound. The barrel came up black and shining, water streaming off it. I set it on the ice and stared at the lid. If it leaked, we would smell it before we opened it. If it leaked, we would know the truth too late. I pressed my ear close. No hiss, no sour breath, just the quiet of sealed wood. I looked at Silas. His eyes were wide, waiting. Hold it steady, I said. Back at the cabin, with the stove hot and the lamp lit, I worked the clay ring away. Pitch had hardened. The cloth was stiff. My knife tip pried carefully. When the lid finally lifted, the smell was earth and cold, not rot. Potatoes sat pale but firm. Turnips held their bite. Carrots were darker but not gone. Silas let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I did not shame him for it. I simply reached for the ledger. December 4th. Barrel 1 opened. Saw food restored. Then I added another line. Because winter is never finished with you. Seal held. Thank the spring. That night we ate boiled potatoes with salt. Not much. Enough. Silas chewed slow like he was afraid it would vanish if he hurried. I watched him eat and felt my chest loosen for the first time in weeks. A blizzard came on December 9th. It did not ask permission. It did not care about our small victories. Snow came sideways. The berm on the north wall took the brunt. The cabin shook under gusts like a living thing. At 2:40, the roof groaned. I got up and pressed my hand against the wall to feel the wind. It pushed hard. Silas huddled under the quilts. The dog lay across his feet for warmth. I fed the stove in careful pieces, not wasting. Then I checked the door bar. Then the window cloth. Then the flue seam note, and still pinned, still a reminder that small work matters. After dawn, a knock came, not loud, weak. I opened the door just enough to see. Mr. Dern's son stood there, face gray, lashes iced. His hands were empty. His pride was gone. "My father's sick," he said. "Wood's out?" He did not say sorry. Men like him rarely do. Still, he stood there in the storm, asking. I looked past him. Snow had swallowed the path. The world was white and close. Silas stood behind me, watching, quiet. In his eyes, I saw the future, and I did not want it to be a hard one. I gave Dern's son 2 sticks of wood. Not many. 2. I also gave him 3 potatoes wrapped in cloth. His eyes dropped to them, like he did not know what to do with kindness. "Debt," he began. I cut him off. "Go," I said. "Warm your house." He left without another word. When the door closed, Silas asked, "Why did you give it?" "Because winter is bigger than pride," I told him, "and because we can." That same week, the deputy came again, but the blizzard had changed the roads. He did not stay long. He saw the drifts up to the porch rail. He saw the soot on my hands. He saw Silas at the table, writing in the ledger without being told. He cleared his throat. "Spring," he said, like it was an apology he could manage. I nodded once. "Spring," I agreed. By Christmas week, the creek ice was thicker than my forearm. 2 feet in places. The doorframe marks looked like a record of siege. I cut another notch and wrote, December 22nd, drift 26 in. Silas traced the earlier marks with his finger. "So, it really did get worse," he murmured. "It always does before it gets better," I said. We opened the second barrel on December 18th at 7:10, when the sky was pale and the wind quiet. The willow pole notches guided us true. The auger sang. The axe rang. The ice gave way. Our hands burned. Still, the barrel came up. This one held more carrots than the first. They were darker, and the tops had softened a little. I trimmed the bad edges and set them to simmer with beans. A pot of stew is not just food. It is warmth you can swallow. I recorded it. December 18th, barrel 2 opened. Carrots trimmed. Waste small. Silas asked why I wrote waste. "Because waste is a thief," I told him, "and thieves should be named." A small shift happened after New Year's. Not a miracle. A change in how people looked when they passed our place. Word had traveled. Not about the creek. Not the true method. But about the fact that we had not starved. Some folks respect that. Some folks resent it. Either way, it makes them look at you differently. Mr. Halley came by once, on a day the road was passable. He brought a sack with a few beans and a strip of lamp wick. He stood on the porch and cleared his throat. "Trade," he said, holding out the sack. I did not ask why. I took it, and I handed him the chit he had written. Credit, 35 cents. Martha H. He nodded as if he was satisfied that paper still meant something. Before he left, he glanced toward the creek. I kept my body angled, casual, like it was nothing to look at. "It's a hard winter," he said. "It is?" I answered. Then I added, soft and steady, "Hard winters teach careful people." He looked at Silas, then back at me. "I suppose they do," he said, and he left without another question. By late January, Silas's cough was gone. The earth berm held. The stove drew true. The ledger kept us honest. We still had the third barrel unopened, our last reserve. I did not touch it unless I had to, because having something left is a kind of peace. One night, after 11:30, Silas asked, "Will my mother come back?" The question hung in the warm air like smoke. I did not answer fast. Fast answers are often lies, even when you mean well. "I don't know," I told him, "but I know where you are." He swallowed. "And where is that?" "With me," I said, "on this land, in this house we buried into the earth." He nodded slowly, as if placing the thought somewhere safe. In February, a thaw tried to come and failed. The sun warmed the roof at midday, and then the cold returned at night and turned melt to ice. That kind of weather breaks things. It splits wood. It loosens nails. It can loosen hope, too. A visible consequence showed at the creek bend. Ice shifted and cracked in a long line. A deep groan rolled through the frozen water. Silas flinched. I put my hand on his shoulder. "It's settling," I said again. "Everything settles under pressure." Still, I went.